brusque, quite a harsh introduction to the world of development. The country itself was at that stage some 3 years from the genocide, but it was still a very unsafe place. There was still a lot of violence going on. The death toll was still running at about 1,000 a month. There were still many, many refugees who had fled across into what was Zaire, now the Congo, and some of those were coming back. There were still lots of tensions within the community, and the whole issue of reconciliation was just starting. I had the privilege of meeting this man, John Stewart, who had worked with World Vision Australia and left a week after I joined it. So he said nothing personal. What I want to do is to go to Rwanda, and I want to actually take part in the program of reconciliation. And I would follow his commentary over the following years as to what a challenging role that was. The issue of genocide in Rwanda, as we all know, was enormous. We saw a massive onslaught by predominantly one section of the population against another, and about 10% of the population would be murdered in that process. So John introduced me to the issues that were involved there and enabled me to see some of the sites, the memorial sites where that genocide had reached its climax. In this photograph here, I'm standing next to Vincent, who was 20. He was in the transit camp at Rwanda, near Kigali. He had spent about 2 years in Zaire, near Goma, in the refugee camps there. He is a Hutu. He was 20 at the time, so he would now be close to 34, I guess, 37. You see he'd lost a leg, and there were many others in that transit camp likewise who had been severely wounded. There were many young children about this size who really had been too young when they had got separated from their families, and you know how easy it is for a child to get separated from a family in a shopping centre. Well, imagine what it must be like when you're with a flood of people going through, hundreds of thousands in any one group, how easy it would be to get separated from your family. And so these children were then being looked after as groups of children with unknown family. And they would have little plastic bags put around their neck, because some of them were too young to remember their names even, or their family names. And in these little plastic bags, aid workers would, whenever a child said something that might be significant, they would write it on the piece of paper, and they would put it in the plastic bag and gather together little bits of information, so that hopefully these children could then be reconnected with their families. It was one of the most moving experiences I had, was actually to be with some reunifications of children who were in fact reconnected with their families. But you did see some dreadful sights. The Ndarama church, where some 3,000 people still there in skeletal form in their clothing. They were massacred while they were in the church. The hymn books that they were holding still lie amongst the, there's no better way to say it than the rotting flesh, the skeletons that were left. And outside, masses of bones piled up as well. And you came across many mass grave sites, such as this one at Nyanza, and to walk through that is a very profound, sacred moment, if you like. So that really gave a very dramatic insight as to what had happened in that country. But the issue then was, how did that happen, and where to from there? Well, in the studies of this matter, and we've talked about this at another occasion, there are 8 stages of genocide that seem to classically be there. First of all, there's the classification, the classification of a group not being yourself, the start of the process of the other. The symbolization, whereby you attach to that other group certain aspects that are not nice, that are not to be desired, that are not your characteristics of your group. You then may even go further to dehumanize that group, to actually suggest that that group are not quite human, so it's going to be okay if you want to kill them off. And the very term cockroaches that was used in Rwanda was part of that process of dehumanizing. Of course, we've seen it before. We saw it in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, where the same process was taking place. But even that is not enough for a genocide to take place. To see the mass murder of over 800,000 people requires huge organisation. It actually does require planning. And there was planning that had gone in a long time before into this particular genocide. It wasn't just the fact that there was an outburst of violence after that plane crashed, and the first report said the violence took place 24 hours later. In fact, it started within hours of the plane crash. No, there had actually been organising taking place, waiting for some catalytic moment to come and to do a cleansing, a genocide. It then takes the polarization of people to sort of separate groups off to make them easier to attack, to kill, and the process of identification goes alongside of that, and that can be such things as happened in Germany, the Star of David, or it can be that the identity cards had to have separate races on them. Now, in fact, courtesy of the Belgian colonial authorities, that had already been provided for. When Belgium took over that part of Africa, and it's a pretty horrible history, I must say, the Belgian colonization of Congo and Burundi and Rwanda, they quite deliberately played up ethnic differences and quite deliberately played up the fact that there were significant differences between Tutsis and Hutus. So they had already laid the foundation for that identification process that would then be so easy to play on in the genocide. Then the actual extermination. And the stories were manyfold. I met people who had lost every member of their families. I met people who had been wounded, severely wounded by the machete attacks that had taken place. But you know those stories, you've heard them all before. But the last point, classically exists in a definition of genocide, is denial. That for some reason or other it didn't happen, or for some reason or other it was a justified activity that it happened. But of course these people were oppressing us. They had power and denied us our freedom, and so naturally we did the right thing. We had no other choice. Or in some cases that we fought back. They attacked us first. And so we thought we were only defending ourselves. So denial can take many different forms. Now, Bishop John Ruciana, Ruciana, thanks, Valerie. He has written quite a lot about this, and he has a very good book it's about his work and writings. It's about the Bishop of Rwanda. In Finding Forgiveness Among a Pile of Bones is what his book is subtitled. He talked about the fact that warnings were ignored beforehand. What happened in that month of April was not without warning. Indeed, there had been a number of flare-ups, and I know, Valerie, you probably spoke about that because you've spoken about that on other occasions, the flare-ups that had taken place in the 60s and the 70s. He said that when truth comes out about something as horrible as the genocide in Rwanda, the world is quick to declare it an atrocity of great proportions. But before such an event occurs, the world is, unfortunately, just as quick to deny its possibility. And that's precisely what happened in Rwanda. That's not going to happen. The rumours that there would be mass murder, but that's not going to happen. But of course it did. He also talks in his book about the very complex set of reactions that you must expect will take place. You cannot have been in such a situation and not be deeply traumatized by it at the very least, but also to have a number of other phenomena that we see in other situations, like in natural disasters, for example, the survival syndrome. Why did I survive? And almost a guilt complex that can sometimes take place. Or in some situations where some who have survived from the group that were being attacked, how did you survive? Even casting some doubts on their survival. And we know that these situations have taken place in other genocide situations as well, for example, in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. Not long after I had been to Rwanda, I had the great pleasure of meeting this man, Antoine who he worked with African Enterprise. He came to Australia on a tour, and I had the privilege of spending some time with him. And he spoke very powerfully about what had happened in Rwanda, but also very powerfully about what was needed for the road ahead. And he made the comment, for example, that I said before, that in the denial process of such things, this is what he said, the Hutus, they presented the Batutsi as the common enemy of all, and all the Bahutu as the target of the attack. In other words, they were the ones being attacked. This worked so successfully that when the time came to massacre innocent people, it was presented and accepted as self-defense. But he made a couple of other very powerful statements. I was telling him about the work that World Vision was doing in Rwanda, rebuilding schools and health facilities and helping families re-establish themselves, bringing emergency supplies, food and so on, and agricultural implements. And he said, oh, that's very good. But you know, we had all that before, and then we lost it. So you're bringing it all back. But we could lose it again. And the reason we could lose it again, he said, is that in the road to the future, there are planted the landmines of history. And we will actually have to defuse those landmines of history planted in the road to the future. And that brings down the very important question of how do you do that? How does reconciliation go about trying to actually make that happen? Well, we know the story that the world did not believe this was going to happen. And when it did happen, in one of the most shameful acts, not only turned its back, actually physically walked away, because UN officers were in Rwanda at the time. And you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda and so on, where this is all played out. But the truth of the matter is that it wasn't just a turning of the back, it was actually a walking away. Bill Clinton would make this comment: the international community, together with the nations in Africa, must bear its share of responsibility for this tragedy as well. We did not act quickly enough after the killing began. The only acting they did was to leave. We should not have allowed the refugee camps to become safe havens for the killers. We did not immediately call these crimes by their rightful name, genocide. We cannot change the past, but we can and we must do everything in our power to help you build a future without fear and full of hope. Now, they're grand words, and some might say subsequent history showed some degree of greater action by the world community in such situations, but in other situations we've yet to see it. The question then comes, how could reconciliation work? I want to tell you one individual story that John Stewart told me when he was working on this program. He told me the story of a woman. He showed me the film interview of her. This woman had been in her house, a small house, and in a bedroom. She was in the bedroom on her knees praying that they might be safe. In this case, they was her and her son. Her son was elsewhere in the house. The door to her bedroom was open, so she was down there praying, and into the house came 3 people who took the son away and murdered him. Some weeks later, one of those young men came back and said, I murdered your son. And the woman said, I thought it was you and 2 others. I saw you kneeling in the bedroom, and I've had nightmares ever since. You come to me in my dreams kneeling, and I can't get you out of my head. The only way I believe I can do that is to come to you and say to you, take me to the police. Have me arrested for the murder of your son. The woman, John Stewart said to him, no. You took my only son and killed him. You will become my son. I will cook for you. I will wash your clothes. You will be my son. Now, every time I hear myself saying that story, I find it hard to imagine the process, the deep psychology that has gone on in that story of that woman. And yet there have been story after story of reconciliation in Rwanda that can match that with their own particular cases. And Valerie, you were just talking about some of that as I came back in. And the special difficulty that happened there, as Antoine Rudisahiri pointed out, is that whereas in South Africa you had one group over there and one group over there, because that's what apartheid was all about, the separating of groups, you could keep the other away from you. In Europe in the 30s and 40s, you could keep the other in the ghettos. In Rwanda, they live side by side. Your neighbor could be the other. So the task of reconciling when you are physically separate is difficult, but it's not as difficult when it's side by side, neighbor by neighbor. And so the challenge of reconciliation became particularly profound for Rwanda. There's an organization called the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, and they have prepared this graphic here, and they talk about what they believe are the steps of reconciliation that they've learned over the years of different situations. They say that some of the essential aspects that are needed are trust, empathy, and a culture of democracy. But they say to do that, you have to have healing, truth-telling, restorative justice, and reparation. And so I want to talk about just some of the aspects that they felt have come from their research on that. They believe there are 3 steps, and I showed you the steps before about the descent into genocide. Well, these are the 3 steps out after genocide. The very first one has to, of course, be replacing fear by non-violent coexistence. If nothing else, at least take the fear away, is an important first step. Secondly, and it can't happen till that happens, when fear no longer rules, building confidence and trust. And even that is only part of the way along the journey. The next step is building empathy, actually building a sense of knowing and coming together. One aspect of that I came across the very first night I was in Rwanda, and I was crass enough, I'm ashamed to say, to ask a question at the table of my guest, the host who invited me to dinner. Well, how different are Hutus and Tutsis? As though it was a crass question. And this person said to me, we don't think that way anymore. The identity cards will no longer tell you. And indeed, it is a moot point because really the intermarriage between groups over a long time results in no clearness about this in any event. But even if it did, we will no longer think that way. We are Rwandese, not Hutus or Tutsis. Now, this group, the International Institute, said there is a flight plan that you need to have. You need to have a proper sequencing and dimensions of the process. The first one is, of course, simply healing, physical healing, physical repair and rebuilding. And then they suggest positive discrimination in favor of the victims. And that's, you might say, obvious. But in itself, it has its own issues. It has its own collateral aspects. And there were situations in those early days, before things moved to another stage, that many Hutus, who had themselves then become refugees in Zaire, fleeing the Tutsi forces coming down, when the situation changed, sometimes exhibited anger that they weren't getting help, because they were now the victims, having been turned back from the previous situation. Locking up leading offenders, and a critical point, saving vital documents. Because in the first step, that is not the time when the process of justice will play itself out. But it will have to happen. And it cannot happen successfully if there has not been a keeping of the appropriate documents. And we've seen that in the situation in Cambodia, for example, where it's been so difficult over many years later to actually trace these documents. And then giving priority to truth-telling. But this may frustrate victims who are in urgent need of housing or medical care. In other words, don't overlook the basic fact that if they're sick and they're hungry and they're not housed, that's really the first thing they're going to need. Move on to the truth-telling stage.